Hello, and welcome to lecture number 21 in our series on the rise of Western civilization, the foundations of Western civilization. Now, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the Augustan Principate, a regime introduced by Augustus Caesar. More explanation about that in just a few minutes. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at the Augustan Principate again. This time, we'll talk about government, institutions, war, the empire. Next time, we'll talk about Roman culture in what is called the Golden and the Silver Ages. Now, you may recall that in our last lecture, we brought the curtain down on the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, that long and stable regime that had existed for some 5 centuries. And we saw that it collapsed amidst civil war, 2 long periods of civil war between 49 and 46 BC, another between 44 and 31 BC. These had been preceded by civil insurrections in the 90s BC and again in the late 80s and early 70s BC. So a long and difficult period for Rome when, you may again remember my mentioning, a considerable number of the leading members of the old ruling class had been killed off. We also talked about political manipulation. We also talked about military ambition. So when, in 31 BC, Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium and achieved a supreme position in the Roman world, the question we have to ask ourselves is, of what was he now in charge? What had happened? What was the state of the Roman world in 31 BC? Well, moving very quickly, moving very deftly, Octavian, who reigned from 31 BC until 14 AD, inaugurated a new regime at Rome that proved stable and that proved successful for some 2 centuries. These 2 centuries, more or less, from 31 BC until 180 AD, we call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Now, the brute reality of this period was that Octavian controlled Rome's armies. That is the one underlying fact without which nothing else really makes sense. But then we come to the genius of Octavian. Instead of flaunting his military power, instead of ruling like a military dictator, instead of putting his jackboots on the necks of his subjects throughout the empire, Octavian in 27 BC made a great show of giving all his power and authority back to the Roman Senate. Well, one can easily imagine the Roman senators having been somewhat flummoxed at this particular political show. And so what they realized very, very quickly was that without Octavian, all would be chaos. Everything would descend into complete and utter anarchy. And so what they did is made a grand show of systematically giving him back all of these powers which he had, as it were, returned to them. And they accorded him a number of honorific titles. Chief among these was Augustus. Now, in Latin, that means eminent, distinguished, particularly important. And so we henceforth refer to Caius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian Caesar, as Augustus Caesar. Now, Augustus, generally speaking, referred to himself as princeps. We can hear the English word prince hiding in there. First citizen, as the first citizen. And so historians refer to his regime as the Augustan Principate, the time when Augustus ruled as princeps and when those who came after him ruled also as princeps. Now, this was not entirely a novelty. You may remember, again, just a few lectures back, that we had talked about the princeps senatus, the oldest member of the Senate, the prince of the Senate, the person who always in the Roman Senate spoke first. Surely that's the sort of thing that Augustus had in mind when he took for himself the title princeps. Now, central to this Augustan Principate were a couple of very simple, very basic policies. First of all, Augustus generally held one or more of the old republican magistracies. He was sometimes consul and sometimes one or another of the other officers of the state, but he permitted regular elections to be held so that other prominent citizens could be elected to one or another of the old republican magistrates, could be seen to have the kind of power, the kind of authority, the kind of eminence, the kind of legitimacy that had always attached to the holding of office in the Roman state. Now, there can be no question about the fact power was in Augustus's hands, but he appeared to share that power with others. In the second place, Augustus retained control of the richest and the most militarily insecure provinces. The rich ones because they poured enormous tribute into Rome and/or, for example, with Egypt, food, grain. Managing the food supply of Rome, managing the food supply of the population of Rome was very important to Augustus in terms of maintaining peace and maintaining order. Maintaining the wealthy provinces, of course, gave him a kind of a stranglehold on the material resources of the Roman world, and maintaining in his hands control of the most militarily threatened provinces meant that rivals to him, generals at the head of armies, could not rise up, as indeed had been the experience of the Roman world, going back at least to the time of Marius at the very end of the 2nd century BC and coming right through that very difficult 1st century. So fundamentally, Augustus controlled the money and the army. That's the two basic things that he controlled. And then in the first place, as I mentioned, he controlled offices in the state, but he appeared to share them. Now, Augustus was also personally committed to all the traditional Roman values, to the traditional Roman morality, to traditional Roman culture. We could say that he made great show of adhering to old Roman values, of promoting the old Roman ways of doing things, of promoting traditional Roman ethics, and it is absolutely true. He made great show of this. But all of the evidence seems to suggest that he was himself genuinely and personally committed to these old Roman values. Now, it'll occur to you perhaps that he was, as a military dictator, a living contradiction of all of those old values, but people have often been able to live with these kinds of contradictory opinions in their mind all at once. Fundamentally, and if we really try to pass a judgment on Augustus, we would say this: he brought peace, security, and order after a century of chaos. If we were time travelers and we went back to 31 BC, when Octavian defeated Antony and was about to be launched on his career as sole ruler, and we said, all right, predict what's going to happen next. Most of us would predict more chaos, and that would be the sensible prediction. We'd be wrong, but that would be the sensible prediction. So Augustus' achievement in bringing order, in bringing stability to the Roman world was a very considerable one indeed. Now, as he drew near the end of his life, Augustus faced a very interesting and a very acute problem. He was, as I've emphasized, a military dictator. He was also, as I've emphasized, a magistrate, or he appeared to be a magistrate. He appeared to hold his power at the pleasure of the Roman public authorities, indeed at the pleasure of the Roman Senate. The reality was different, but this is how he portrayed himself. How does one transmit a regime like that? How does one hand it on? In the Republic, year after year after year, there were elections. There was peaceful transition of power from one year to the next, from one year to the next, over 5 centuries, or at least over the first 4 centuries of the Roman Republic. That, of course, all came unstuck in the 1st century BC. But how is Augustus to hand this regime on, and what kind of a regime is it? Well, that's really 2 separate questions, isn't it? How is he going to hand it on, and what kind of a regime is it? What kind of a regime it is, we'll trace out in the next few minutes. The question immediately before us, how is he going to hand it on? Augustus had no heir. He had never produced, he had one daughter who herself produced no children. He himself produced no sons. So finally, near the end of his life, he adopted a man by the name of Tiberius, who was the son of his second wife by her first marriage. In other words, he was looking around for someone with whom he had a plausible connection, and he named Tiberius as his heir. The remarkable thing is that when Augustus died, Tiberius succeeded him, and there was no return to civil war. There was no return to chaos. There was an orderly succession of power. That, perhaps, in retrospect, is the crowning achievement of Augustus's reign. Not only that he was able to produce, for more than 40 years, peace and order in this Roman world, but he was able to transmit it in wholly new circumstances. There had never been a transition of power in the Roman world like the one that took place in 14 AD. Now, from 14 AD until 68, Rome was ruled by members of what we call the Julio-Claudian family. The family remembrance now is that Julius Caesar was the first ruler, Augustus Caesar the second, and then 10 more followed as members of this Julio-Claudian family or Julio-Claudian dynasty. They are all people who have direct or indirect succession to Julius and Augustus Caesar. Now, the Julio-Claudians are in a variety of ways an odd lot. Tiberius, for example, was an old, rather suspicious man who was probably a pederast. Caligula was crazy, there's just no question about that. Claudius was physically handicapped and paranoid. Nero was an unbalanced genius. He's the one who fiddled while Rome burned. This was also a time, in some ways, of intense political strife and political controversy, too. Caligula, for example, was assassinated. Claudius was poisoned. Nero committed suicide. So we might say, if we're going to think about these Julio-Claudian rulers, is it the case that the Augustan Principate held, that the Augustan settlement persisted, or had Rome, in fact, descended once again into the anarchy of the 1st century BC? Well, the paradox is deep indeed. One way, I suppose, of getting a feel for it would be to say, let's imagine two space travelers to the United States. They can come now, if you please. And one of them lands in Washington, and one of them lands anywhere else you like in the country, really, maybe somewhere out in the Midwest. And they stay for a few months, and then they go back to wherever it was they came from, and they have a conversation. Would they not suppose that they had landed in two different worlds? The world of Washington, the world of government, of gossip, of busybodies, of all of the activity, all the self-serving activity, all the self-important activity that goes on, and most of the rest of the country, people peacefully going about their lives and business, without much reference, actually, to what goes on in the middle. Well, now let's imagine two comparable visitors, two comparable travelers in the 1st century AD. And one landed in Rome, where there was all this strife and controversy and oddball rulers and political assassinations, and another landed almost anywhere in the provinces of the Roman Empire. And then we'll send them back where they came, and we'll have a conversation between them. And they, too, would imagine themselves to have visited two completely different places. Here again is a tribute to the remarkable success of the Augustan achievement. The Augustan Principate, the Roman Empire, the regime Augustus created, went chugging along its way, working remarkably well, even though there was a certain amount of difficulty, stress, chaos, crisis, and odd goings-on at the very heart of that regime. Something sufficiently stable had been produced that it didn't absolutely depend on the character or the ability of the ruler himself. This is also a time when new territories are added to the realm. For example, the British Isles. Excuse me, Britain. The Romans didn't conquer Ireland. When Britain was conquered by the Romans, this was a time when the Roman world was extremely well governed. It was a time when Roman finances were put on very sound footings. In other words, in a whole variety of areas of public life and public administration, this was, in fact, a very successful period indeed. So let me just repeat. It was a tribute to the genius of Augustus's settlement that the Julio-Claudian period was so stable and effective and well governed, when if we only looked at the capital or we only looked at the emperors, we would conclude, uh-oh, things are in big trouble once again. Now, a year of civil war in 68-69 did not return Rome to the turbulence of the late Republic. Again, a test of the system. 4 generals in succession competed for the imperial office. 3 of them fell away, and finally one of them, Vespasian was his name, succeeded in making good his claim, and he ruled for a decade, from 69 until 79. Now, Vespasian inaugurates what we call the Flavian dynasty of rulers. A little bit later in Roman history, Flavius actually becomes one of the honorific titles for an emperor, but now this is the Flavian dynasty. They're members of the Flavian family. And Vespasian is succeeded by his son, Titus, and then by his son, Domitian. Titus ruled from 79 to 81, Domitian from 81 till 96. And he ruled really quite effectively until Domitian's sort of growing autocracy eventually earned him assassination. But then, as we'll see in just a moment, there was another peaceful transition of power. So we had moved from the Julio-Claudian family to the Flavian family, and we had moved across a year of civil war in 69, and yet still the Augustan settlement held. Now, with the assassination of Domitian, we might suppose, all right, now surely trouble will come. And basically it did not. In fact, Rome now got perhaps the best set of 5 emperors in a row that the entire imperial period produced. History remembers them as the 5 good emperors. Nerva, who reigned from 96 to 98, a very short reign. Trajan, from 98 to 117. Hadrian, from 117 to 138. Antoninus Pius, from 138 to 161. And Marcus Aurelius, from 161 to 180. Now, I don't actually expect that anyone will remember those dates. I mention them only because, apart from the very short reign of Nerva, who died a peaceful death, you'll notice perhaps that the rest of these reigns were rather long. Lengthy reigns can produce, by themselves they may not, but they can produce stability and order. And that is certainly what happened in the Roman world of the 2nd century. One long reign after another of one extremely competent, gifted ruler after another. Now, in a dynastic system, there is, of course, no guarantee that son will succeed to father or adopted heir will succeed to the person who adopted him and be successful. But in this particular instance, the Roman world was blessed with a succession of very successful rulers. This was also the final period of Roman expansion. Under Trajan, for example, the empire reached its greatest extent in territory. Trajan conquered, sort of went beyond the Danube in the northern Balkans and conquered the area which then was called Dacia. Today this is roughly Romania. All right? So this was the last expansion of the Roman world. You'll remember, perhaps I said just a moment ago, that during the 1st century AD, the Roman legions had gone into Britain. Now, that's worth pausing and reflecting on for just a second. Remember that the Romans went to war with the Carthaginians in 264 BC, and at the end of that war in 241, they annexed Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, the first territories outside Italy taken by the Romans. So formally, we can date that acquisition of territory to 241. The Roman Empire continued expanding until the very first years of the 2nd century AD. In other words, this was an imperial system that continued to expand for some 350 years. So Roman conquest did not come all at one moment, and as we'll see in later lectures, it did not disappear all at one moment. So this was a regime that grew for a very long time. Now, anyone who has visited Rome and has been near the old Roman Forum may have seen Trajan's Column, this beautiful, very tall column around which is carved in bas-relief a history of Trajan's Dacian campaigns, the last of these great campaigns waged by the Romans to expand the size of their empire. Now, of this world, of this Augustan Principate, the incomparable historian Edward Gibbon, who wrote in the 18th century, we'll be occupied with Gibbon again in a later lecture. Gibbon wrote these words. He said, in the 2nd century of the Christian era, the empire of Rome comprehended the fairest part of the earth and the most civilized portion of mankind. The frontiers of that extensive monarchy were guarded by ancient renown and disciplined valor. The gentle but powerful influence of laws and manners gradually cemented the union of the provinces. The peaceful inhabitants enjoyed and abused the advantages of wealth and luxury. The image of a free constitution was preserved with decent reverence. The Roman Senate appeared to possess the sovereign authority and devolved on the emperors all the executive power of government. During a happy period, AD 98 to 180, of more than 80 years, the public administration was conducted by the virtue and abilities of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the 2 Antonines. Well, historians do indeed refer to this period, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Let's reflect a little bit on this Pax Romana. We may take our prompt from the late first century AD Roman historian Tacitus. We'll meet him in a little bit more detail in our next lecture when we talk about the culture of the Augustan Principate. For now, let's just notice that he was the greatest historian of this period, and he made a couple of very critical points in his historical writings about this period that we have come to call the Pax Romana, though he had himself experienced and seen and wrote about only the first half of it, really. First of all, he said, with wry humor, the Romans made a great desert and called it peace. Second, he observed that the unspoken secret of the Principate was that the army could make or unmake an emperor. So he saw that there was this dangerous element there with the military, and he saw that Rome's vast empire was not something, after all, that all of those peoples, from the north of Britain to Mesopotamia, from the North Sea to North Africa, had asked for. Old Attalus of Pergamum might have willed his kingdom to Rome, but nobody wrote to the Romans and said, if you have some time next week, could you please come and conquer us? The Romans marched forward. Always, remember we talked about their notion of defensive imperialism. They had the idea that they could only fight just wars, that they could only fight if they had been attacked or affronted in some way. So the Romans always contrived to describe every one of their wars as a war in defense of themselves. Somebody had threatened them, and then they went forward and conquered them. Well, Tacitus understood the reality of the situation. Still, at the very heart of this regime, there was a partnership between the emperors and the senatorial elite, which worked very well. Now, let's emphasize there, it was slowly but surely, in the last years of the 1st century BC and across the 1st century AD, a new senatorial elite that had to be constituted. It was made up not so much of the old traditional Roman families, as indeed of men who came from other parts of Italy, and indeed, slowly but surely, of men who came from other parts of the Roman Empire as well. Senators did not try to seize the imperial office or to restore the republic. When, for example, one or another of the Julio-Claudian, or even the one Flavian emperor who was killed, Domitian, when these men met their end, senators didn't try to replace them. They didn't try to put themselves in their place. They didn't try to recreate, to resurrect the Roman Republic. You remember when the senators killed Julius Caesar in 44 BC, we asked, when we were discussing that, what did they have in mind? What did they think was going to happen? And it seems that some of them perhaps were just blindly jealous of Julius Caesar. Others, however, seem somewhat naively to have supposed that Caesar was the problem. Absent Caesar, the republic would come back and all would be well. Well, by the time we move into the 1st century, people understood perfectly well that the Roman Republic, though much to be admired and written about, was gone. So the senators had enough sense to share power with the emperors in this regime that we call the Augustan Principate. Now, if Rome's peace had been imposed by force on people who had not asked for it, and surely that's the situation. We must always bear that in mind. And a little bit later, in later lectures, when we start to talk about the unraveling of the Roman Empire, we have to remember that we're not so much dealing with usurpation or rebellion or people being disloyal to the Romans. These people had, after all, been conquered by the Romans. So in a certain sense, local autonomy, local interests, and so on, rose to the surface once again. But that's a story for a later day. For now, I want simply to say that even if Rome had imposed its will on these peoples around the Mediterranean world, the fact is Rome brought considerable benefits. First, an enormous free trade zone which promoted trade, which promoted a lack of local disturbances. This peace imposed by the Romans made trade possible. It made agriculture flourish. You may just recall that quite a few lectures back, we noticed that the Persians had done the same thing. In their very large empire, remember the Persians built roads, and the Persians created a post office, and the Persians created unified system of weights and measures, and unified systems of coinage, and thus promoted trade through a world which, previous to the Persians, had been a sort of a crazy quilt of peoples. In a very real way, the Pax Romana repeated that kind of situation. It created a world where economic opportunity existed in ways that had not been true before. Provincials were accorded a measure of protection. particularly those who lived along the frontiers of the Roman world. People who lived along the frontiers of the Roman world had always been subject to, victims of, cross-border depredations by various peoples who lived outside the Roman world. Rome now protected those people, protected their lands, protected their territories. Rome assumed the burden of defending this vast empire. Again, in a later lecture, we'll have to ask questions about whether Rome assumed a burden simply too large to have been carried with grace and success over the long haul. Rome provided other things too. Roman law, a system of law, a system of public courts, a system of public justice, a system of order throughout this world. Rome provided a vast system of roads. To understand the importance of the Roman system of roads, one has only today to drive in Britain, to drive in France, to drive in Italy. And when you drive on the autoroute and the autostrada, you're driving on the Roman roads. The Romans knew exactly where to put roads, and they built quite remarkable roads, roads that were preserved down into modern times, and then, of course, paved over and turned into modern tollways in various countries of Europe. The Romans ruled through cities. Every province of the Roman world was equipped with urban government, and when Romans went into a city, they gave those cities a set of urban amenities. They would create amphitheaters, they would create theaters, they would create bathhouses, they would create fora, they would create a whole panoply of great public buildings. To travel in the Roman world, in what was the Roman world today, the Mediterranean world, is to still see many of these buildings in lots and lots of places. Cities flourished. Under the Romans, urban life flourished. Now, largely that was a result of Roman peace, that was a result of Roman fostering of economic opportunity, and it was also due to the fact that the Romans ruled through cities and that cities played a decisive role in the Roman system. How did the Pax Romana work? How did the Pax Romana work? Not at Rome, whereas we've seen what we have is this elegant and tenuous partnership between military dictators and senatorial elites, but how did it work out there in the empire, in this vast area ruled by Rome? First, let's bear in mind, Rome asked for relatively little. They collected taxes, but that wasn't new. People had been paying taxes or tributes to various rulers for a long time. They asked for loyalty. They asked for loyalty. Now, that really was a negative thing. People were not to act against Rome's interests. It wasn't a positive thing. Rome didn't actually ask people to do very much. They asked them not to harm Rome's interests. So for the vast majority of people around the Mediterranean world, Roman rule was no more onerous than any of the rules they had experienced previously, and in some cases, it was actually more benevolent. It's important also to bear in mind that the Roman regime was simply too small to demand very much. The entire Roman administration consisted of a few hundred administrators, this vast world. The Roman army was not used as a police force. It certainly wasn't used as a secret police force. It wasn't used to maintain control over people. It was used to defend the frontiers of the empire. So the Roman presence was absent. The vast majority of people in the Roman world would never have laid eyes on a Roman official or a Roman soldier, much less a Roman emperor. So the Romans were not a constant presence. So the question then is, what made people buy in? The process of what we call Romanization, people going over to the Romans, adopting, yes, Latin, adopting some of the trappings of Roman culture, but in particular showing their loyalty to Rome, was a very long, a very slow, a very steady, and largely a voluntary project. The Romans did not demand Romanization. People throughout the Roman Empire slowly but surely Romanized themselves, embraced various trappings of Roman culture. Now, one of the things that we will see in a later lecture is that slowly but surely people learned how to retain their Romanization and decouple that from loyalty to Rome. So I'll just signal that now as a theme we'll come back to. But now, people Romanize and couple themselves to Rome. There was much in Rome for them. Well, despite all of the positives and Gibbon's glowing assessment, the storm clouds were gathering. As we'll see in later lectures, eventually the Augustan Principate also failed, as indeed the Roman Republic had failed before it. But none of this should blind us to the remarkable achievements of these 2 centuries when, as I suggested at the outset, no one at their inception would have wagered that this Roman world had the tiniest chance at peace and order and security. Augustus' achievement was a quite remarkable one.